George Miller almost directed a Justice League movie, and the history of the DC films would have been a lot different had Justice League Mortal happened. More than 60 years after its comic book debut, the Justice League has only had one theatrical live-action film, 2017's Justice League. Zack Snyder's Justice League was eventually released in 2021 but as an HBO Max exclusive, and with no current plans for a Justice League sequel, it's clear that nailing DC's most famous superhero team is not an easy task, which raises the question of how good George Miller's Justice League Mortal might have been. While the X-Men and the Fantastic Four had already received live-action movies in the early 2000s, the idea of superheroes who could carry their own films coming together in a team-up movie was still too ambitious during the first decade of the 21st century. It was only in 2012 that Marvel's The Avengers happened, a movie that felt way bigger than anything Fox had done with the X-Men or the Fantastic Four. Still, movie-making technologies are not the only reason that prevented a Justice League movie from happening sooner, as Justice League Mortal got very close to being made. The Justice League Mortal project dates back to 2007 when writers Kieran and Michelle Mulroney were tapped to write a Justice League film for Warner Brothers. George Miller would then join the project later that year, and it did not take long before pre-production started. By the time the 2007-08 Writers Guild strike started, Justice League Mortal already had a cast and costumes, and it was close to starting shooting. However, the studio was reportedly not happy with the script, but any major rewrites had become impossible due to the writers' strike. Planned filming for George Miller's Justice League movie was then moved to April 2008, but after months of rumors and a lack of official information, Justice League Mortal was eventually cancelled. Justice League Mortal became one of the biggest, what could have been, scenarios in superhero movie history, especially after the script surfaced online in 2013. Had George Miller's Justice League Mortal happened, DC would have had two versions of Batman on the big screen at the same time far before what is currently happening with the DCEU's multiverse. Green Lantern and Man of Steel would have never happened, and the DCEU as audiences know it would never have started. What was George Miller's Justice League Mortal about? Going by Justice League Mortal's revealed script, the George Miller Justice League movie would have been heavily inspired by the DC comic book arcs Justice League, Tower of Babel and Superman, Sacrifice, the former of which was eventually adapted into a DC animated movie. Justice League Mortal would have not been an origin story, and it would have instead started with the Justice League having existed for years. George Miller's Justice League would not have ties to any previous or current DC movies, meaning no Brandon Routh's Superman or Christian Bale's Batman. George Miller wanted Justice League Mortal to be the beginning of a story, a very different strategy from what the MCU and even the DCEU would do years later. Justice League Mortal's roster would have featured Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Barry Allen, Green Lantern, Jon Stewart, Aquaman, and Martian Manhunter. Talia al Ghul and Maxwell Lord would have been the villains, and the movie would have ended with Barry Allen's death. Justice League Mortal would have competed with Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Justice League Mortal began to be developed in 2007, 2 years after Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins premiered. Therefore, by the time George Miller joined the movie, Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight had already wrapped. As such, had Justice League Mortal not been cancelled, the George Miller Justice League film would have been released between The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, and it would have featured a completely different Batman from Nolan's. Considering how multiple versions of Batman on the big screen can still be confusing even with multiverse-related stories like The Flash, having another Batman in a Justice League movie concurrently with Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy might have been a problem. Justice League, Mortal's reception, if positive, would have had a negative impact on Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, as audiences could have wanted more of Batman's Justice League adventures rather than another solo Batman story. In that scenario, The Dark Knight Rises might not have ever happened. If, however, Justice League, Mortal's reception ended up being negative, then The Dark Knight and its sequel would have been used as an example of how DC superhero solo stories work better. Justice League, Mortal would have rebooted Superman way sooner. Superman Returns was released in 2006 to mixed reviews and claimed $391. $1 million at the box office on a $204 million budget, meaning that the movie would never be granted a sequel. A Superman reboot only happened 7 years later with Man of Steel, but had Justice League, Mortal been released, then Superman would have been rebooted a lot earlier. DJ Catrona would have reportedly played Superman in Justice League, Mortal, in what would have been the second live-action Superman iteration in less than 4 years. Justice League, Mortal's Superman would obviously not have any connections with the Christopher Reeve, Brandon Routh one, which would likely have caused some confusion in the audiences given how close to Superman Returns George Miller's Justice League film would have been released. Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern doesn't happen. Justice League, Mortal would have reportedly featured Common as John Stewart, who by then was arguably the most popular Green Lantern given the success of the DCAU's Justice League. Justice League, Mortal's John Stewart would have then been the first ever live-action theatrical Green Lantern, and the 2011 Green Lantern movie starring Ryan Reynolds as Hal Jordan would have never happened. Considering that George Miller's Justice League film would introduce another Flash at the end, Wally West, potential Justice League, Mortal sequels could have perhaps featured Hal Jordan in some capacity. Still, there is no mention of Hal Jordan in the Justice League, Mortal script. Justice League, Mortal would lead to solo films if successful. Justice League, Mortal would have led to solo DC superhero films featuring those versions of the Justice League heroes. That might not have been the case for Superman and Batman right away, especially if Nolan still got to release The Dark Knight Rises in 2012, but it would have happened with other heroes like Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, and Flash. There were, in fact, projects for Wonder Woman and Flash films being developed around the same time Justice League, Mortal was happening, and those would most likely have been replaced by Justice League, Mortal spin-offs had the George Miller film been successful. The DCEU wouldn't exist if Justice League, Mortal had been released. The biggest impact George Miller's Justice League, Mortal would have had if released, is that DC would have the setup for a shared universe far before the DCEU happened. Justice League, Mortal would have come out no sooner than 2009, meaning that Marvel's plans for an Avengers movie and a shared superhero universe would have already been known by the industry. With Justice League, Mortal leading to a sequel and potential spin-offs like Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, and The Flash, then Man of Steel, and Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice would have never happened. The first Justice League film would have come out almost a decade earlier than what eventually did, and the DCEU starring names like Henry Cavill, Ben Affleck, and Gal Gadot would not exist. That said, nothing guarantees that Justice League, Mortal would have been enough to not only kickstart but also sustain a cinematic universe. DC had several scrapped movie projects in the 2000s, which shows how difficult it is to adapt the Justice League heroes to the big screen. It's also important to notice that director George Miller would have most likely only worked in the Justice League Mortal sequels, if at all, meaning that Justice League Mortal's hypothetical success would not guarantee the success of the spin-offs. Key release dates: Black Adam release date, the 21st of October 2022. Shazam! The Fury of the Gods release date, the 17th of March 2023. The Flash movie release date, the 23rd of June 2023. Blue Beetle release date, the 18th of August 2023. Aquaman 2 release date, the 25th of December 2023.
With a gentle touch you tell me what all love I have to share. It must be 'cause you are what I all knew. Only you do know, you do know, you do know. Only you do know the courage. Still moving, still sad, thought to know what went wrong. Have sat there low out of the wind, what if you could bring them down